I'm gonna fight for you. Nothing's ever gonna burn this down. I'm gonna fight for you till the breath in my lungs runs out. Our love is something I don't wanna lose. So every single day you're what I choose. I'm gonna fight for you. Oh, I'm gonna fight for you.
Hello, everybody. You are listening to the Fight for You podcast. I'm your host, Joe.
And I'm your other host, Crystal.
We are a husband and wife married couple. This is our first episode. We're just going to call this episode Introduction. In this episode, we just wanted to give you a chance to get to know Crystal and I a little bit better. We're going to share a little bit of our stories and talk about our mission with this podcast, what we want to do through the Fight for You podcast. We're going to start out in this episode by sharing with you a little bit of our stories and talking to you about what we want to do with this podcast, our mission and our goal in doing this. So we're going to start off by sharing sort of our personal stories, and in a nutshell, Crystal and I, leading up to how we met each other.
Well, I'll go first. I grew up in Texas. I was born and raised Texas girl. And I was a Southern Baptist girl, and that'll be funny later. I grew up as an only child. My mom and dad worked very hard, but I had a really pretty great life. I did drill team, I did dance, I did plays and all sorts of things, and I dated a lot. And I had two pretty big heartbreaks. One was very big, and it kind of changed the path of my life. And in college, I guess I need to go back. I became a Christian when I was a little girl, but in college is kind of where I started to have a real relationship with Christ after my breakup. God just kind of grabbed me back and said, I have this other plan for you. And I actually started listening to his plan. And so I was an intern at Central Baptist Church in College Station. Shout out to Chris Osborne and Peggy. Love you guys. And George Jacobus. Sorry, I didn't mean to forget you. And God kind of brought me to this point of I had an open summer for the first time ever, and Frontier Camp was available. And so I interviewed and I got accepted and I was destined to become a senior counselor at Frontier Camp for the summer.
Well, I was born in Pontotoc, Mississippi, the second child to a pastor and his wife. My father has been in some form of full-time vocational ministry ever since I was born. He and my mom met teaching school. They were both teachers. I was homeschooled K through 12. My parents, being teachers, felt that was the way to go, and they wanted to make sure that I had Bible in my education. Because I was raised in church and I was brought up in a Christian household, I was saved at a very young age. So young that I don't actually remember the specifics of it. But I accepted Christ when I was about 4 years old. And not very long after that, my parents moved to Colorado so my dad could take a pastorate in a small church there. And I grew up, like I said, in the church pretty much every time the doors were open. I knew so much in my head about the Christian faith. And I got very good at, I just applied that Christian veneer to my life. It looked very good from the outside. I knew all the right things to say. I knew all the motions to go through so that everybody around me thought I had this great relationship with Christ when I really didn't. And in a way, I'm very grateful for how I was raised, but it's just one of the pitfalls of being brought up in a very active Christian household especially ministry, you can kind of get jaded to all of it, and you know how things are supposed to feel before you actually get to experience them for yourself. And so I got very good at that sort of that chameleon-like faith. And I had a few relationships, some more serious than others throughout high school. And then I graduated high school, and a week after I graduated high school, my parents got us together for a family meeting around the table and announced that they were separating and mom was leaving. And that sort of threw a grenade into our family and into my life and plans at the time. I didn't wind up going to college or anything the following year because my family was kind of in shambles, and it didn't work out that way. And so I spent that year that I wasn't in high school, but I wasn't doing anything else, working. I worked a few different jobs and just kind of spiraled down into bitterness and depression, and ultimately kind of wound up walking away from God and walking away from my faith for a while. Fortunately, God wasn't going to let that be the end of my story, and he won me back. And part of that process was going to Bible school. I went to Bible school in a little town in Wyoming. I went to Frontier School of the Bible there in LaGrange. And while I was there, I had one more relationship that wasn't very long. And after that, God sort of convicted me that I needed to stop dating. I needed to turn that area of my life over to Him. And so I made God a promise that I wasn't going to date anybody else until I knew for sure that they were the person that I was supposed to marry, even if that meant never dating anybody ever again. And once I did that, God really started to work in my life. It was kind of like that was the last thing that was the last area of my life that I was kind of holding out on God with, and He just started to work. And the next step was being called to work at a camp in Texas in the summer. So the camp director came to my school and was recruiting, and I talked to him and really got a good feel about him and the camp. And so once that school year was over, I packed my bags and headed to a small town in Texas to be a senior counselor at Frontier Camp, which was where we wound up meeting each other. And the story about how we met is very funny. It has a lot of little nuances, and we'll skip a bunch of those. Basically, I arrived during the first wave of staff training, and I resolved to myself that I wasn't going to date or be interested in anyone at the camp. I mean, I had kind of already made that resolution, but I just, I was doubling down on it. I wanted to be a very good counselor, very devoted to the work that summer, just no distractions of any kind. And so I kind of got there and I felt out relationships with people, and I said, okay, this is good. Like, I don't think I'm going to have anyone who's going to make my resolution a problem. This is going to be good. And the second week that camp was there, we had campers in our cabins, and all of a sudden I noticed all these new people walking around. And I asked somebody, who are these people? And they said, oh, this is staff training week 2. So there were 2 staff training weeks, and I sort of went, even in that moment, I kind of went, uh-oh. This was not in my plans. And during that week was the first time I remember meeting Crystal. I don't remember which happened first, but my first 2 memories of her are both dance related. The first one, I'm not sure if this is chronologically first, but the first memory is that we were having a counselor dance off because it was a rainy day or something, and they made us do a counselor dance off.
Yeah, that's not the first one, but yeah.
And she did the best robot I've ever seen. I mean, yeah, I've never seen anybody bust a robot like that. That kind of shocked me. But I guess this was the first time they were doing a square dance in the chapel. Mm-hmm. And I was feeling very awkward because I had just sprained my ankle really bad and I had a boot on my foot. And so I couldn't really do anything. I'm just sort of hobbling around the circle, doing as much of the moves that the guy was calling out as I could, and apologizing to everyone every partner that I was with, because we switched partners often. And then I remember getting switched to Crystal being my partner. And I just had this like mini explosion in the back of my head. And I was like, she's gorgeous. This is going to be a problem. And so that was my first memory of Crystal.
My first, I remember the square dance. That's why I know it's first. But I actually don't really remember Joe. I just remember a guy in a boot because I was so overwhelmed. I had never even gone to camp, and all of a sudden I'm thrown into this extreme camp experience. And so the training at Frontier Camp is hardcore, but it's so that it prepares you for your entire summer. And since I had never even gone to a camp, I was a fish out of water, to say the least, and I was very overwhelmed. And so I remember going to the square dancing, and I remember being with a kid in a boot, but I had no idea that was Joe. My first real memories of Joe were just number one in worship time, because he was doing guitar stuff in worship time. But I guess I really don't know for sure, because I was so overwhelmed. I actually, right after training, went home for the weekend, and nobody was home, and I cried the whole night on the night before I had to go back to camp. And the only reason I went back was because I signed a contract saying I would be there for the summer. God had bigger plans, but I was just terrified. And so it took me a few weeks to be okay and to notice anybody. That's not to say anything about Joe. It just took me a while. But I think the first time was... I thought Joe was a jerk at first. I'll be honest, and he already knows this, so this is no surprise to him. I had a job. My job was to be at the top of the slide and, ask kids questions as they go down, or just be there for safety reasons. And Joe kept coming to the top of the slide with his kids, and he was basically telling me how much my questions were terrible. And because I'm a teacher and I think of things that make sense, it's very hard for me, or at least then, to be goofy and crazy and just say nonsense, which is what I guess the kids wanted. And he was just giving me a really hard time. And he kept coming back up, and I seriously was like, dude, leave me alone. Go play with your kids somewhere else, and let me do my job. And I really was like, okay, I do not like this kid. That was my first memories of Joe.
So as Crystal and I began to get to know each other, we both began to realize that there was chemistry there. But that's not to say our relationship didn't face some serious hurdles right at the beginning. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, that she thought I was a jerk. That was her initial impression of me. Secondly, that we were both so determined not to have a relationship, and that was not what was supposed to happen, that we were both fighting it very hard. And she fought it more specifically than I did, and she actually came up with a list of 5 reasons why she was not going to date me.
Yes.
5 very hard and fast reasons, and she told me.
Yes.
She actually told me that she had 5 specific reasons why she wasn't going to date me. And I remember what all of them are. I was younger than her.
Yes.
She did not want a camp relationship.
No.
She didn't want a long-distance relationship.
I've done that before. No.
And after the summer, I was going to be going back to Wyoming to finish my senior year. She didn't like the fact that I had a tattoo. No. That was a no-no. And I wasn't Southern Baptist.
Yes.
I was from outside the fold. So we did get past that, obviously. And so we acknowledged that the chemistry was there. We got to know each other better. We would go on walks. We basically...
Well, we went on walks before we went on dates. There had to be some establishment.
No, the walks came before the dates. But we got to know each other. We shared our life stories. We went on a couple dates. There was some rigorous testing from Crystal's close family and friends that involved...
Shout out to Tracy, if you're listening to this, John and Tracy.
Any of the Williams family.
Yes.
Basically, we got grilled together, then I would get grilled alone, then Crystal would get grilled alone, then they'd bring us back together. It was like something off of Criminal Minds or Law and Order. And I also had to prove my proficiency with firearms.
Yes.
Certain
Didn't
things
the kids
like
even
that.
have Chris, Cam, and Cody? I think need to do something.
I think they did. But I passed.
Yes.
And when we went on our first official date, this is one of the cool parts of our story. When we went on our first official date, she dropped a serious bomb on me right from the get-go. She wanted to ask me a very serious question. And she just said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "What do you think the roles of the husband and wife are in a biblical marriage?" This first date, driving to the first date. And the point in our lives we were both at, we were both ready for something very serious. We were both ready for marriage. The question didn't faze me. I also determined that in my answers to any questions she had about anything, I was going to be honest. I wasn't going to try to say what she wanted to hear. I was going to say what I really believed myself, because if that revealed incompatibilities, then we shouldn't have been together. And I knew that, and so I was determined to answer very honestly. And I answered, gave the answer to the question, and she goes, "Okay," and she gives me this funny look, and my discernment kicked in, and I said, "That's not the only question, is it?" And she looks a little embarrassed, and she says, "No, it's not, but we don't have to do it right now." And I said, "Hey, go for it, shoot." So she reaches in her purse and pulls out a list on a piece of paper. I think there were 15. There were 15 questions.
I think so. I don't know. I don't remember.
Something like that. All very serious questions on the caliber of the first.
Well, and the reason why I had these questions was because I dated someone for 3 years, and it didn't work out. And I thought I was going to marry this person. And God had different plans, and that's been such a blessing. But I spent 2 years being single. And that's not to say I wasn't asked out by guys, but I just very much, once I got out of that relationship, I knew that I wasn't going to settle again. Like, there was no more, because I was settling. It's not that he was a bad guy. It's just we were very different, and it wasn't what God had for me.
And different in the wrong ways.
Yeah. Not different in like, oh, that's great, but different in some very big ways that...
Like incompatibilities.
Yeah. And so... to keep myself from dating someone that could potentially lead to that again, I looked at some things that were really important to me and that were non-negotiables for me, and I came up with the questions. And Chris Osborne actually gave me a really hard time about these questions and said, "No guy's gonna go through this." Well, I found one, so but it wasn't meant to be all on the first date, but it just kind of.
But I was up for it, and so I just kept answering honestly, not even really knowing what the list of questions was about, why it existed. But Crystal's deal was any guy that she was going to date had to be able to answer those questions, and if they couldn't, they didn't get to date her.
Yes. And most of the time, they didn't know they were answering these questions. I will say that. It wasn't like I pulled off the paper.
Right,
it was just, we would have conversation, and if they said something that I didn't agree with, I'd be like, oh, okay, I can't date them.
That's on the list. But everything was accelerated and different about our relationship. So
well,
that's
it was
why
camp. We couldn't talk during the
Right,
week. It was
that's-
all Saturday.
So that's why the questions all came out at once. And so I answered every single question all the time, wondering at what point am I going to fail this test. And we get done. I answer the last question. I look at her, and she's giving me this very funny look. And I said, "Is that it?" She goes, "Yeah." And I said, "How did I do?" And she's looking at me so strangely. And she says, "You passed." And I kind of looked at her again, and I said, "Isn't that a good thing?" And she goes, "You don't understand. Mm-hmm. No guy in 2 years has ever answered correctly. Mm-hmm. Has ever answered every question correctly. And you just perfectly answered every single question."
Well, part of me was hoping that he'd say something wrong, because then I'd be off the hook. And I'd be like, oh, well, this isn't it. So I can just move on. Because I thought I was just being a girl, and I wasn't wanting to date anybody. And you messed that up. Obviously.
I did. So we dated throughout the summer, and then at the end of the summer, I went back to Wyoming, to Frontier for my senior year. You were student teaching in Houston. Mm-hmm. And we always knew that we were going to get married. From the start, when we officially began our dating relationship, I told you I want to date you with the intention of marrying you. That was our end game from the beginning. There was no messing around or not, there was no, we were very clear about where we were going. And so we got engaged about 3-4 months later.
From when are you talking about from when we became boyfriend girlfriend, or when we were dating, or?
To be honest, I don't really make much of a distinction between that.
Okay, well.
But so we got engaged on New Year's Day.
Yes.
2000.
It was probably 6 months after we had
about 6
started
months.
dating.
Yeah. And so we got engaged New Year's Day, and the wedding was going to be that July.
Yes.
That we figured that out pretty quick. So that's when we got engaged, and that's really where the story of this podcast and our heart behind it begins. Because when we got engaged, it was like putting that ring on your finger was flipping a switch in our relationship, and all of a sudden it got terrible. And neither of us really knew what was going on. I mean, we had some idea of some of the factors that were to blame, but there really was no explanation for why it just got so awful so fast. And one of our driving, one of the driving forces behind this podcast is I think that when couples get into trouble, when they encounter a situation that they weren't prepared for and that they weren't expecting, a lot of times it's easy for them to feel alone. It's easy for them to feel like they are messed up somehow. And
when you don't want to talk to anybody about it, because you don't want them to think bad of this person, because you really do love them, but at the same time, if you don't talk about it, then...
Right. So it's kind of, it feels like an impasse, and it's awkward, and it's difficult. And I think there's a lot of shame and a lot of, I feel like in a lot of cases, there's nowhere to turn for help.
Because your family's going to automatically side with you.
Right. That doesn't make it any easier.
It doesn't help.
And it's just hard. It's very hard. And that's how we felt, I think, when things started to get so bad. And I think that both of our families and circles of friends kind of looked at our situation and thought, maybe this is a sign that you guys aren't right for each other. I don't know what's going on, but obviously, something is really wrong. And that just added to the shame and the worry and the anxiety.
Yeah.
Our people say that, engagement is supposed to be this super romantic, fun time.
It was terrible.
It was awful. Ours was not that way at all.
So if yours isn't, have faith. It gets better.
Yeah, and you're not alone.
You're not alone.
Our engagement was horrible.
I would never go back to that time. Like, ever. I would go back to other terrible times in my life before I'd go back to that.
We were to the point very quickly when we got engaged where we would talk on the phone every night, and it was horrible. I would wake up depressed in the morning because I knew for certain that night we would get in a huge fight that would last for hours.
Yes.
That was every single night.
And it
of our
almost became
engagement.
like a love language for me. Like, not the fighting part, but like, I knew you cared because you fought for me.
And I did have to do a lot of that.
Yes. I hung up the phone quite a few times.
Yes.
Don't do that.
And it even got to the point where about a month before our wedding was supposed to happen, it was worse than it ever had been. We were fighting so much. And I don't remember what we were fighting about, but I remember how it ended because you said our engagement was off. It was over, and hung up the phone.
Yes.
And I remember thinking to myself, I said, okay, there's your window. Like, if you want out of this, you can get out of this and totally look like the good guy. It wasn't a particularly malicious thought. It was sort of the fact that presented itself to me.
Well, you were exhausted.
No,
I was exhausted.
I was burned out. The feelings weren't there.
No. Well, we were states apart. We couldn't feelings are there in person. It's hard to have feelings over a phone.
Yeah. And so I thought to myself, this is my window. If I want to, I can just let this be the end and say she ended our engagement, and we'll go our separate ways, and that will be that. But going back to how we met and how I had made that commitment at Frontier that I was not going to date anyone until God told me this is the person you're going to marry. Well, right at the beginning of Crystal and I getting to know each other, before we'd really acknowledged there was chemistry or anything like that, we went for a walk, and she kind of told me her life story, and it hit me during that walk. And when I dropped her back off at her cabin, I was walking through the woods to the boys' cabins where I was staying, and it hit me like a lightning bolt. I just, the Holy Spirit spoke through spoke to me and said, that's the woman you're going to marry. That's her. And I remember freaking out because I was like, this can't be possible. This isn't realistic. I texted my best friend and accountability partner at the time, Kyle, and told him, hey, you need to pray for me. And he said, why? And I said, because I just met my future wife. And he naturally was very skeptical because he had been with me at school only about, 2.5, 3 weeks before. Mm-hmm. And he kind of said, whoa, pump the brakes, Joe. What's going on? And I said, no, man, I'm for real. God told me she's the one. And so flash forward back to this time in our engagement. The reason ultimately that I chose not to take that out that Crystal had given me was because I truly believe that God wanted us to be together. God wanted us to be married. And I chose to honor that commitment and follow his lead even when I didn't feel like it. That it was the last thing I wanted to do. But I hung in there. I picked up the phone. I called her back and eventually got through to her. And it wound up that my friend, my best friend and roommate at the time, Andy, actually bought Crystal a plane ticket so that she could come and see me and we could sort of hash things out in person. And there was a moment where I told Crystal, I said, look, we're supposed to be getting married in a month. If you don't want to do this anymore, then I won't be mad. I won't be upset. I'll take you back to the airport. I'll wait with you till we can get a flight arranged and you can go home. And I promise I won't make you the bad guy or be upset or anything like that. I want to make sure that if we're going to do this, that we're both in 100%. I just wanted to make sure that if we did this, if we went forward and got married, that we were both doing it because it's what we really believed was the right thing to do. And obviously we did. We got married. And
Yay!
And I'll never forget this. My wonderful cousin, Emily, came up to us on our wedding day. And she comes up and she smiles. And she's from Mississippi, so she has the accent. And she goes, y'all, the second year is great. And then she said that she had looked at her husband recently. And he had asked her, you didn't really like me the first year, did you? And she sort of sheepishly replied, I like you now. and that kind of just stuck with me, and it wound up being a very poignant piece of advice because our first year sort of continued in many ways our engagement.
It was as bad.
It wasn't as bad
because we had each other. We were in person.
Yeah, but it was bad.
Was still bad.
Some of it was internal stuff that the two of us were working through. Some of it was external stuff, difficult situations that we were in the midst of or had to work through. But it was not how people describe your typical first year of marriage.
No.
And again, I think we sort of get into a habit of thinking that all good marriages, as they start out, will look one way. And that can kind of shame couples into feeling like if their first year is tough or if they start out, missing beats with each other, that they're doing something wrong and maybe they shouldn't have got married in the first place. And you can really get into bad territory following that line of reasoning. And again, that's sort of the heart behind our podcast is to sort of pull the curtain back on some of this marriage stuff and to say, it doesn't have to follow a formula.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to look like people tell you it's going to look,
Every marriage is going to be different. You are going to have struggles. They could be the same as someone else, and they could be totally different, and that's just kind of how it is.
Yeah. And ultimately, we have a wonderful marriage, and God used our experiences fighting and being in so much conflict at the beginning to teach us how to deal with conflict well.
Yeah.
And that's experience that has proved invaluable for us, and as we counsel other couples and help people in their own marriages to give them hope of, these experiences that you have that are bad, they will be redeemed if you hang in there. You will learn from them. They will, the disadvantages now will prove to be advantages later.
Yes.
And we really want to encourage people with that, and oftentimes we'll share specific stories from our experiences and things like that. But now that we've sort of helped you get to know us a little bit in the background of our story, we just want to talk a little bit about our mission, about the mission statement of the Fight for You podcast. Really, it has sort of three. There are three statements contained within our mission statement. There are three facets of it. The first is we want to help couples fight fair and fight for each other.
Yes.
One of the things that rips me up the most, partially from being a pastor and performing weddings, part of what rips me up the most is watching couples quit on each other. Watching marriages fall apart, often within a year or two. Just not even getting past the breaking in period. Watching so many marriages fall apart because the couples will not fight for each other. They claim to have done everything when really they've done nothing. They claim that they've exhausted everything and that there's nothing else that can be done when really they haven't even begun to fight for their marriage. And Crystal and I are both very adamant that marriage is absolutely worth fighting for. And fighting is not nice. It's not pretty. No. It's not easy. It's painful and it's hard and it hurts.
And you have to be real. You have to be transparent with each other and yourself. And that's really hard.
And really by definition, fighting for your marriage means not quitting, not throwing in the towel when all the circumstances and all the feelings dictate that that's what you should do.
Well, and it's about there is no winner unless y'all are together.
Right.
Like, who cares who wins the fight?
Right. So we want to help couples fight fair, as in when there's conflict between the two of you, we want to share from our experiences to help you navigate that conflict better and ultimately how to come out of that conflict with positive results. And then we want to encourage and help you to fight for each other, to not give up, to hang in there when it's tough, because we believe it's so very worth it. So that's the first part, to help couples fight fair and fight for each other. Secondly, we want to shine an authentic light on the whole picture of marriage. Marriage is a wonderful thing, but I think it's often misrepresented.
Well, it's the wedding and the knight in shining armor coming in on his horse and romantic, and I'm sorry, that's not marriage. There are parts of that are marriage, but that is not marriage.
It's definitely not the whole picture.
No.
And there are things that it's so sad, but there are so many things that contribute ultimately to resentment and bitterness in marriages when the real problem is unrealistic expectations or putting your priorities in the wrong places. So many couples, it's all about the wedding. It's all about this huge, amazing, romantic wedding. They say it's the best day of your life.
And we're not knocking weddings. Weddings are great, but they are not the focal point of a marriage.
And ultimately in marriage, it shouldn't be best day of your life.
No.
And,
Our wedding is not the best day of my life, I'll tell you that.
And part of that is because love, it grows and matures,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, I value my relationship with Crystal so much more than I did then. I didn't know what I had then.
We didn't know each other then. You think you know them. You have no idea until you start living with them.
So, you know, we just want to shine an authentic light on the whole picture. You know, we want to laugh and cry together about the good things, the bad things, the stressful things, and just all that stuff, because ultimately we believe that the whole picture of marriage is beautiful, and it is what God intended. You know, it's fighting for each other, it's sticking it out through the tough times, it's committing to another person regardless of what happens, and when you do that, that I think is where the nature of Christ is truly revealed in marriages.
Yes.
When you get to see that selfless, sacrificing nature come out, and that ability to be wounded and to be, you know, to give of yourself for another person. The whole picture of marriage is such a beautiful thing. So we want to shine a light on all of it.
Yes.
And third and finally, we want to share our experiences in the hopes that people will be encouraged. And this just kind of goes back to what we mentioned before of how, unfortunately, couples can often wind up feeling alone because of the issues that they face. And I think fighting and conflict in marriage is a big part of that, especially not that it's not present everywhere, but especially in marriages.
Yes.
Or not marriages, in the Christian faith and in the
Yes.
Christian community. It can be almost taboo sometimes to talk about
Your problems.
and to talk about conflict in marriage, beyond just like, you know, beyond just very sort of surface level stuff. And I think there's definitely a line that you don't want to cross where you can overshare, and that's not helpful or edifying either. But I think that there's so much more that can be done.
Well, and I think God leads you to talk at certain times. Like, if someone comes to me with a certain problem that we have had, I may not share that with other people, but they need to hear our story so that they can get through it, and you talk about what worked for us. So I think that it kind of depends on the situation, but like, I mean, you wouldn't want to share it to everybody.
Right. And so, you know, there will be specific things that we don't get into, but across the board, we have a wonderful marriage. Crystal and I love each other very much,
Yes.
but we have worked through conflict. We have worked through
We're still working through.
don't ever get the impression that we feel we've arrived. Please. But we know that there are certain cases where we've just been there. And we know that in a sense, I wish this something like this podcast had existed for us when
Yes.
we were going through some of that stuff, because if nothing else, it would have allowed us to feel like we weren't alone and there wasn't just something wrong with us. And so if you get nothing else out of this podcast, but it can do that for you, it can make you feel like everything could actually be okay. You're not alone. You're not flawed. You haven't made some giant mistake by marrying this person. That, you know, there is hope, and that people have walked some of those paths that that no one's talking about. That's our goal.
Yeah.
For the Fight For You podcast. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to talk about some topics that really matter to us, and it's just going to be a lot of fun. Really looking forward to sharing that with you.
Yeah. You said it great. I don't know what to add.
Well, with that, I think we'll wrap this episode up. Please subscribe and join in so you don't miss an episode. We are really going to enjoy producing this for you guys. Hope that you enjoy and are encouraged by listening. We'll see you next time on the Fight For You podcast.
See ya.